I think we got that going. Yes, recording. Very good. Well, hi everyone. Welcome to another plant talk. I will ask you first to put your microphones on mute so that we can keep the background noise down to a dull roar over here. I'm Michelle DeRusha, Communications and Events Coordinator for Nebraska Statewide Arboretum. Justin's got a great presentation for you today on selection and proper planting of trees, just in time for Arbor Day, which is coming up on April 26th. Before we get started, I just want to remind you again I'm going to mute a couple of people here that I see because there's a little bit of background noise. Keep your microphones muted, please. So before we get started, I just wanted to remind you of NSA's big event that's coming up in less than 2 weeks. We have our Spring Affair plant sale. It's April 25th through 27th. Most of you probably heard about it. It's at the Sandhills Global Event Center in Lincoln. That's the Lancaster Event Center under a new name on 84th Street. So we still have some tickets left for the preview sale, which takes place from 7 to 9 p.m. on Thursday, April 25th. And if you really want to get the best pick of the plants and beat the general admission crowds, it's really worth purchasing a ticket in advance. They're only $20 for Arboretum members and $25 for non-members. And the great thing is that ticket sales benefit the statewide Arboretum's work, tree planting, garden making, our educational outreach work all year long. So it's like a donation, which we appreciate. So you can go to our website, plantnebraska.org, and that's where you'll get all the information about Spring Affair and purchasing a preview sale ticket if you're interested in doing that. We also have general admission Friday, April 26th from 2 to 6 p.m. and Saturday, April 27th from 9 a.m. to noon. And there's always a good bit of inventory left on those days. So don't worry if you can't make it to the preview sale. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Justin for his presentation. We will monitor the chat. If you have some questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself as we get toward the end of Justin's presentation, and you can just ask your question, whatever is most comfortable for you. So, Justin, you can take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Michelle. Really appreciate that introduction. She said it would be an awesome presentation. We'll see about that. But I do like to talk about trees, and with Arbor Day coming up, let's talk about the trees we should be planting more of. That was the big idea here. And then to also think about how to properly select from a nursery and properly plant them. So that's part of it. Excuse me. I see Marilyn Hines on here. Just so you're aware, we do have certified arborist credits that will be coming up at the end of the presentation. So I'll get your certification numbers at the end here if I remember to do that. So Marilyn, you might need to remind me, or anybody else who's certified. I'm going to sit down here as I do this. So thanks for your patience there. It's spring here in Nebraska. It doesn't look like it every day, but do we remember a year ago, we were coming off one of the driest winters we had, and ended up in the driest spring in eastern Nebraska that we could remember. Literally almost no rain in April and May last year. So it's tough to be a tree in this part of the world for sure. And yet we want trees. We need trees around us. So how do we pick good trees for this tough part of the world? We're going to talk about that. And then also, let me say right up front here, some of you are tree planters. Bob Fewer, I see you were on here. Nicole Stoner and Graham Herbst, you're on here. As we go along, if you have favorite trees to share, I'd really love to hear from you. What, Marilyn, are you out there in Aurora too, or Central City, places like that? Where can we think about tree diversity in other parts of Nebraska? You don't need to just hear from me here. So let's find 5 minutes somewhere in here to really share with each other about our favorite trees. Okay, can we do that? I might challenge a few of you to chime in. I hope that's okay. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see that. Can we see that, Michelle? And can you see my pointer? Okay, yeah, I might point at things on some of these screens as we go along too. So prepping for Arbor Day. It's coming up here the last Friday of April. When is that? April 26th is official Nebraska Arbor Day, but it gets celebrated different days around the state, and that's a good thing. In Waverly, where I live now, we usually do it the first week of May because we're too busy Arbor Day week with Spring Affair and other people's Arbor Day, and you can make Arbor Day work for you whenever it makes sense. But technically it's officially scheduled Friday, April 26th. It's a fantastic holiday, one of the top 3 holidays, I would say, even though we don't get the day off. But man, any holiday that is focused on trees is a good holiday, in my opinion. So let's dive into this thing. Here are just some key thoughts that we're going to try to hone in on as we do this hour-long presentation. Plant more trees for sure. Trees are awesome, and we're losing the canopy of the shade trees in a lot of our communities. We're not keeping up with replanting compared to how many trees are going out. So yeah, let's get jiggy with it and plant trees, the right tree in the right place. I don't have any magic bullets or any magic trees for you. I'm not going to be able to share with you anything new or unheard of today, but we still have a wide variety of trees to think about, and I'll be able to share with you at least some of the perspectives I have in dealing with trees across the state the last 30 or so years. I would say we should always try to emphasize regionally native species, partly because they have the genetic capacity to tolerate our weather extremes. And boy, is our climate already extreme. So one thing we're talking about in our shop is looking south for tree inspiration, believe it or not, to Kansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Colorado. Those are places that are a little hotter and drier than us, and that weather is coming our way with climate change. Pay attention to genetic provenance. That just means, where did the tree originate from? If you buy a bur oak, for example, that is one of the most fantastic native trees in Nebraska, but you got the seedling from Texas, it might not be the best tree. And also, that same species grows up in Manitoba, Canada. Don't get a Canada bur oak. Get a Nebraska or a Kansas or an Iowa bur oak. Does that make sense to you? Buy good nursery stock. If we don't do that right, nothing else matters. Now, you can grow your own trees, but let's support our local nurseries where we can. And just beware that if you're buying from a box store, they're not going to stand by the quality of their stock like our good local nurseries who pay more attention to it. So beware of invasives. What we're seeing right here in eastern Nebraska right now, the last 2 weeks, is the flowering of ornamental pear trees. They are escaped pests running all over the Midwest. Literally thousands, if not millions of them are popping up all over our eastern Nebraska neighborhoods now in ditches and ravines and woodlots. We need to quit planting that tree specifically, and we might talk about a couple of other problematic species. Well-behaved non-natives are okay, though. Our native trees hold a lot of promise to us, but let's be real. Our communities, our neighborhoods, the native soils are gone. And sometimes our native species aren't the best choices in tough sites. And we can talk about a few non-native trees. And then proper placement, planting, and management are critical. Getting the right tree is only one thing to do. If we don't plant it properly and care for it properly, none of the rest is going to matter, right? So let's think about that. And just remember the goodness of trees. Holy cow, do they do a lot of good for us. Who would want to live in a Nebraska community without trees? I sure wouldn't. So I love the fact that we've created these community forests all over where we live. Every town is a community forest. And these are just some of the benefits that trees are providing in the background. And they ask for almost nothing in return. So let's have trees around us indeed. And then just this notion that time spent amongst the trees is never wasted time. I got to tell you, for me, my physical health and my mental health is made better by going to places where there are trees physically, or in my mind. I go there too. I have every so often, I have this panic thing come over me with anxiety. And one of the best things I can do is breathe deep. And then I go to a forest, sometimes with my grandson tagging along with me. And it's all better all of a sudden. So just, the trees. You've heard of forest bathing, things like that, being amongst the trees. Medical research is starting to show that we humans evolved as a species amongst trees. We find comfort in there. There's something physical to that about our connection to our trees. So now, when we're talking about what trees to plant in this world, it's kind of a conundrum, isn't it? How do we create biodiverse, resilient community forests that have to do all these things we want them to do, including balancing tree adaptability with landscape function, and now ecological issues on top of that? So here's some of these tough challenges we have. A tough and changing climate, no doubt about it. It's getting worse, but it's already bad here in the Great Plains. So there's a story here to say our Great Plains trees are some of the best to choose for this. Species diversity and age diversity is an issue across our community landscapes. We don't have the best species diversity, and we don't have as good a resilience when all our eggs are in one or two baskets. So if we have too many ash, too many maple, too many elm, diseases come along and cause a problem. Remember the 10% rule, maybe across a neighborhood or a community. You don't want any one species to be more than 10% of your inventory. And probably it's better if it's more like 5%. Then there are disease and insect problems always coming on, always something lurking, especially as we stir up the biodiversity pot across the globe. We're bringing insects and other plants around that are invaders, and they're often diseases on the trees that we have here. What about just adaptability to urban sites? We're constantly digging in the soil, working on our houses and businesses. It's changing all the time. The soil is not always real good. And here in the urban environment, trees are often asked to grow in really tough soils. So how do you pick the right tree? Tree availability is a big issue. I'm going to talk to you about several trees that I love and that we should plant more of, but if you can't find them, how are you going to plant them? And it takes work sometimes. So here at the Nebraska Forest Service and statewide Arboretum, we're trying to prime the pump in the nursery industry to have more of these trees available, but you might have to work a little harder to find them. Let's put a plug in right now for the Nebraska statewide Arboretum. If you want to get seedlings and small trees, a lot of the things we talk about here, you're going to be able to find if you have patience. Insect and pollinator health is an issue. Native versus non-native plants is an issue. And then invasive species we touched on already. So it is a changing climate. It's already tough here in the Great Plains. And you might have heard last year that the eastern Nebraska cold hardiness zone maintained by the U.S. Department of Agriculture jumped a zone or a half a zone. So we are now considered 6B in southeast Nebraska, and then all the way up to 4B in the northwest part of the state. So that hardiness zone is just based on average minimum winter temperatures. So those averages are definitely creeping up. But the big problem for us in the Great Plains, it's not the average that's the problem. It's the sudden temperature drops spring and fall. We can go from 70 degrees to 12 degrees overnight, and that's really tough on trees in the spring and the fall. And then look on this map on the right. This is the average annual precipitation we get for our Nebraska. This is average annual. Last year was nowhere near this. 30 inches in southeast Nebraska. No, we barely reached 20 inches in the Lincoln area. So we were off by a third last year. And out here in western Nebraska, I'm from Kimball County, we were lucky to get 15 to 20 inches a year in a good year out there. So it's just a different part of the world, and we need to get trees to grow across all these regions. It's a tough challenge, but we have trees that work here. Let's always remember that. So The Great Plains sits at an ecological crossroads, literally where east meets west. The eastern deciduous forest that goes all the way to the east coast of the United States reaches its western limit in southeast Nebraska. So we have a lot of species that reach their limits here, like white oak, black oak, red oak, hickories, sycamore, white ash, hawthorns, things like that. Do we use them much in the landscape? Probably not. And then in western Nebraska, we have western species that reach their eastern limit: ponderosa pine, limber pine, Rocky Mountain juniper, Rocky Mountain maple. Those are trees we can think about using too. And it's those native trees that have that genetic capacity for climate tolerance, because they're native in a part of the world where we've had droughts that have lasted 20 to 30 years at a time, real wild stretches of wild temperature swings. So these trees are tough and adapted if we put them to good use. And then the value of native trees, remember this, it's our native insects and birds that evolved, and other animals that evolved with these plants. So the more native plants we have around us, the more wildlife biodiversity we'll have too. And that's a good thing. You may not think about it, but we want a wide variety of birds, insects, pollinators, butterflies, bees, frogs, toads, snakes, yes, and even bats. We want them in our neighborhoods and in our landscapes. And the more we use native trees, the more that we get. The Nebraska Forest Service and the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum try every year to expand the palette of plants available for use that are tough and adapted and meaningful to Nebraska and the Midwest. So we work with nurseries and other cooperators across the region to go out and find these trees, collect them, and grow them. And you know, it's tough duty, right? Some of us get paid to go collect seeds out of our native forest. That's tough work, isn't it? Yeah, we love it. It's fantastic to go to Indian Cave State Park, and you can pick about 20 species in a fall. That's where they reach their range limit. All our oaks and hickories and pawpaw and even understory wildflowers. We're so fortunate to have that in our state, just a little bit of it. But we also look south to Kansas. Believe it or not, central and southern Kansas has several native trees we don't have here. For example, pecan, Shumard oak, and soapberry. Those are things we should be planting more of up here in Nebraska. And then for our western Nebraska and southern Nebraska constituents, we're looking west into Colorado, Wyoming, the Black Hills, but also southern Colorado. There's some amazingly tough and adaptable trees. Again, soapberry and different types of oaks, netleaf hackberry, things that we could be planting more of in western Nebraska. We're trying to track these things down, get them in collected and growing in the statewide arboretum system, and then out to our nursery cooperators. We collect from remnant populations, like there's these are both Ice Age relic stands of trees, the Burro Canyon in southwest Nebraska, and then the stand of limber pines out in western Kimball County. They've been stranded there since the last Ice Age, so thousands of years. Some of these trees are hundreds of years old as individuals in these places. We collect the seeds and grow them up and try and get them out. They're good choices for our part of the world. And then we're looking at urban survivors too. Every town is an arboretum when you think about it. If you get out and look in backyards and alleys and the front yards and along the streets, there's amazing varieties of stuff. Grandma and Grandpa went to Colorado or Tennessee and brought back a tree, and those trees are out there. Big, amazing old tulip trees and black gums and spruces and firs. And they're saying, hey, we're adapted here, plant us. So we try to collect seeds from some of those wonderful old trees too. So what to plant in Nebraska? We realize that over 100 varieties or species of trees can be grown here. And when you add in cultivated varieties and hybridized species, it's probably over 300, 400 types. How are you going to pick amongst that, right? That's overwhelming. Well, I just want you to know there's lots of plant lists online here. The Nebraska Statewide Arboretum has a great catalog of some of the plant lists we've pulled together over the years. It's a bit overwhelming, so I'll try to hone in on about 20 species here coming up to whet your appetite and to think more about. But there's a lot of stuff that'll grow here, and that's good to know. because the more diverse our community landscape, the better. Everybody would prefer a top 10 list. I can't do a top 10 list for trees because I love them all. So I came up with a top 20. These would be my top 20 to focus on today. And in the fall, it's probably going to be a different group of 20 because I'm seeing different things coloring up in the fall or something. But here's 20, and I'm not going to run through them right now, but these will get highlighted as I go forward here. This is my 20 for today. And it is helpful to know that these 20 trees are probably underutilized in a bigger sense, and we should be planting more of them. But I hope I harped enough on this idea of diversity. Let's plant a diversity of trees, not only in our home landscapes, but also in our neighborhoods and across our communities. That diversity is going to give us the resilience to climate change, insects, and diseases going forward. If I could only plant one shade tree forever now, I've said this and I'm still there, it would be a bur oak. It's just a fantastic Great Plains native tree, gets tall and wide. It would shade the whole backyard of a house in time. And it will live for literally hundreds of years if you do it right. And it does yeoman service, great service for pollinators, birds, and wildlife. It's a fantastic tree. And it's never overplanted. If there's just a few of them in our neighborhoods, even though it's our best native oak, let's keep planting it. A cousin of the bur oak is the chinquapin oak. The two can actually hybridize. They don't do that easily, but this is a southern and southeast Nebraska native, tough as nails. It grows across the state. We don't plant it enough. 40 to 50 feet tall is probably going to be its design size, and 30 to 40 feet wide. It's tough in urban conditions, and we're really seeing it adaptable all across the state and the region. For those of you in western Nebraska, come on, man, let's get with it. The Gamble oak is a cousin of the bur oak, and it will hybridize with the bur oak, but it is just absolutely fantastic. It's not a fast grower, but it can be a shrub if you want it to be, slow growing, and keep it like a plum thicket. Or if you want it to be, you can get genetics in this plant that are a little more tree-like, and it might be 40 to 50 feet tall when it gets to be an ancient tree. And it often has a nice red fall color that our bur oak doesn't have here in the east. The tree on the left is from the Kimball County Fairgrounds Arboretum out in western Nebraska. Just absolutely a fantastic mid-height tree for western Nebraska. I could talk to you all day about oaks, and someday we'll do a webinar just on oaks because holy cow, there's 30 to 40 types that we can plant here without just that are native to North America. Here's 20 that I listed, and we literally could go on for an hour or two about it. So when I talk to you about species diversity, people often say you also don't want a family of trees to have too much prominence in a community. So would we want oaks to account for more than 10% of a community tree inventory? I actually would. I would make an exception for oaks. If oaks were closer to 30%, I wouldn't have a lot of concern in a neighborhood because there's literally 30 species to pick from. We wouldn't want to do that same thing with maples or elms or something like that. But that's just a personal opinion on that. Okay, it can't all be oaks, can it? Unfortunately. So we better think about some other things. And a tree that has proven itself just absolutely fantastic choice for the eastern half of Nebraska is the pecan. It's a native tree, native to Texas, Georgia, southern parts of the U.S., up into southern and central Missouri and southern Kansas. And it has proven itself to be a great shade tree for much of Nebraska. Lincoln and Omaha, it's a no-brainer. And I even have a picture in here from Kearney out in central Nebraska, street tree that gets not a whole lot of care. I'll bet Mike Fernley, I see you are on here. You might know about some of these wonderful pecan trees south of the University of Nebraska Kearney campus out there that are saying, plant me. I'm a fantastic tree for you. And if you're worried about mess, yes, they produce edible seeds, but they are not a messy tree because the squirrels and the jays and the other birds will clean them up before you ever get around to it. So a great native Nebraska tree is the bitternut hickory. It's got this wonderful yellow fall color, reliable fall color, and it's got the shape, form, and similar appearance to our green ash. We're going to be losing green ash literally by the thousands going forward. So a good substitute would be the bitternut hickory. It can drop a nut crop some years, but usually not a big problem or a heavy mess problem. So a tree we don't use enough of. People love maples. I love maples too because they color up so nicely in the fall and they're lovely shade trees. A red maple is a fantastic tree, but it's becoming overplanted. And I would say a tree we don't use enough of on the side of maples is sugar maple. That's more of a New England, Eastern US native tree, but there are sugar maples native into southern Kansas and Oklahoma, including a variety they call Caddo, which is amazingly heat and drought tolerant. So if you can track that down, it would really make a fine choice for much of Nebraska, sugar maple. And then out in western Nebraska, there's a sugar maple cousin that grows out into the Rocky Mountains, the Wasatch Range in Utah and into Wyoming, and that's called the big tooth maple. It's a cousin of sugar maple and just more acclimated to western Nebraska with those wider temperature fluctuations. The American linden is a native tree from eastern Nebraska up along the Niobrara River, and it's proven itself adapt. Every community has nice American lindens, but we got away from planting American linden and we started planting the European little leaf linden because of its formal shape. Well, let's get back to American linden. They're the better tree in the long run, and they're more resistant to Japanese beetle attack. They smell great, easy to grow, drought tolerant, tolerant of our storms. They're absolutely fantastic. The sycamore, it's hard to get people to want to plant a sycamore because they're tall, wide, and kind of rangy. And then people curse about the mess they drop with their flaky bark and the big leaves in the fall. But man, a sycamore is at home in eastern Nebraska like no other tree. And it's amazingly drought tolerant when established, but also tolerant of wet soil. So if you have a wet spot in your yard, and does anything beat the fall, or excuse me, the winter color in that bark of a sycamore? When I was a kid, the American elms were dying literally by the millions across the Midwest and in Nebraska. They took 13,000 American elms out in 1 year in Omaha in the late 1960s. Our communities were loaded with American elms, and I saw them coming down as a kid. So we quit planting elms pretty much in general with that lesson from Dutch elm disease. But 50 years hence now, we've got a lot of hybridized elms on the market and even American elm varieties that are disease resistant. So we can think about elms to plant. And here's just 3 of my favorites that I think we should do more of. The one on the left is Triumph elm, an amazing drought tolerant, fast growing tree with an elm with real good structure too. A lot of elms are problematic because they grow so fast, they come apart in storms, like this American elm in the middle, Jefferson American elm. It needs really close and careful pruning to keep it into a good shaped tree going up, but it's still a good tree. And then the tree on the right is a Japanese elm, native to Asia and China, but it's maybe a 30-foot tall grower, slower grower, acclimated to the Midwest and the Great Plains. A bald cypress, this thing amazes me. Look at that picture on the lower right, Louisiana swamp. Bald cypress in a Louisiana swamp growing where the water gets up 3 or 4 feet on its trunk. But these trees on the left, I took this picture last fall, they're out in North Platte, Nebraska. Oh my God, that tree said, how are you going to plant me in North Platte, Nebraska? Yes. It's amazing how wide-ranging that tree can grow. And we're learning that it's pretty darned adaptable to any consistently moist site in the eastern half of Nebraska. And it often gets great fall color. It's drought tolerant when established. So if you're after a deciduous conifer tree, try bald cypress, especially if you have a wet spot. I love me my native Ohio buckeye. Ohio buckeye is native into southeast Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, Missouri, and it grows just amazingly well across our state. Some of the best buckeyes you can see are out in Ogallala, North Platte, Scotts Bluff, Cheyenne, Wyoming, of all places. So it's a tough tree, and we usually get good fall color on our western trees that we don't get here in the east because we get blights on our leaves here in the east that usually defoliate the tree late summer, but it's still a great tree, great for wildlife with those buckeye fruits and often good fall color. One great thing about the buckeye, and I'll say this about hackberry too, these are two trees that can do summer dormancy. If we have a really severe drought, the buckeye, the hackberry, the ginkgo, they can drop their leaves midsummer and just say, the heck with this. I'm waiting it out until next year. We're shutting her down. And the buckeye can do that, which is one of the reasons it's so adaptable to dry and hot conditions. The opposite of dry and hot conditions are going to be moist conditions, and the black gum is a fantastic tree for moist sites. If you have a heavily irrigated yard or a stream edge, try that black gum. It's an eastern U.S. native, but it's got these wavy undulating branches, this tight triangular shape, and it won't get taller than 30 feet or so in our part of the world. And it's a fantastic tree for fall color. Not the most drought tolerant tree in the world, but really a fun tree to try in your backyard. Track it down. This would be a great Arbor Day tree to try this year. Everybody likes a flowering tree, of course, and we'll look at just a few ornamentals here. Black cherry is one we don't plant enough of, in my opinion. It's a native Nebraska tree, grows in our hardwood forests, and it wants to be a tall, upright tree pushed up skyward by the forest trees around it. So it's similar to a chokecherry in terms of its fruiting and flowering, but it's a tall tree with good fall color, great for wildlife, good lumber. There's a lot to like about an ornamental black cherry. And would be a great substitute if you think you need that ornamental calorie pear. Skip it. Skip that ornamental pear and plant some of these other things, like a serviceberry or Juneberry. There are 2 or 3 types of serviceberry that grow into small trees. And here in eastern Nebraska, the shadblow serviceberry and the downy serviceberry are 2 really good choices. These are trees that have great spring flower, a summer fruit. That's why they're called Juneberry, the most tasty berry that we get on a tree in our region. And then great fall color. So a multi-season interest tree. And they're best sited with maybe afternoon shade or dappled shade in association with other plants, but they can be grown in full sun. But they're going to be an understory tree, maybe 20 feet tall or so. Just like the oak trees, we could talk all day about the crab apples. We just don't have time for it. But just be aware, if you want a good tree for wildlife habitat, something that smells good, and then something that has nice ornamental appeal, it's really hard to beat crab apples because they come in all these wide-ranging colors, shapes, and forms. And they're not the invasive pest that ornamental pear tree is, but they're just as tough. And they still feed birds. And they're native, at least partly so, to our part of the world. So here's some of my favorites. The Dolgo crabapple is an old-fashioned tree that has big fruits. They're almost about half the size of a regular apple. So they can be kind of messy, but they're great for jams and jellies and eating right off the tree. The Donald Wyman is a crabapple 20 feet tall with white flowers. David, Prairie Fire, Adirondack, Golden Raindrops, Royal Raindrops. Those are just some of the crab apples that we can grow out here and put them to work in our landscapes. Yep. Another understory or ornamental tree that's not known for flowering or anything like that, but you would still love to have in your landscape is this shade-tolerant tree we call musselwood, hornbeam, or blue beech. It's one of the most common trees in the understory of the eastern deciduous forest in the United States. It's not quite native here to Nebraska, but not far from it in Missouri and Iowa. And it really is a great understory tree, planted in the shade of other trees, and then really appreciate that bark as it starts to mature, that sinewy bark that actually looks like somebody flexing their muscles, that smooth bark. It gets good orange, red fall color. And then the nutlets, it's in the birch family. And these nutlets that hang off the tree are actually edible to people if you want to try and eat them, but the birds love them. And if you had some of these trees spreading around from birds, you'd be happy with it. So that's a few of the deciduous trees to think about. Let's quickly look at a few evergreens. It's becoming harder to grow evergreens, especially in eastern Nebraska. Our changing climate is part of that, especially with warmer winter nights and higher humidity causes a lot of foliar diseases on some of our evergreens. So here's just quick thoughts about evergreens. Just remember, we're not Colorado when you go visit the mountains. Leave that scenery there. Don't try to repeat it here in eastern Nebraska, or you're probably going to be unhappy over time with our blight diseases. But thank God for spruce and juniper and pines in western Nebraska. They're really critically important to the canopy trees in those communities. Climate change is going to have a big impact going forward. There are so many diseases and blight pressures on some of these things, especially Colorado spruce, Austrian pine, and Scotch pine. So place carefully and put them in the landscape where you can let the low branches reach to the ground. You don't want them in a place where you have to limb them up. Think about airflow around these trees in eastern Nebraska. If you're thinking in terms of a windbreak in eastern Nebraska, don't plant a solid row of evergreens, but mix in deciduous things with that to improve the airflow around those trees. And then help manage red cedar encroachment. That's the only native evergreen here in eastern Nebraska, red cedar. And so we don't want to say it's a horrible plant, but it is running amok in some of our wild lands and prairies and pastures. So we've got to manage red cedar, but it's still a useful tree, especially as a nurse tree in a landscape. Still one of the best is our native ponderosa pine, which grows out into central Nebraska. It's native into the Rocky Mountains primarily, but we have native trees in Nebraska. This is a picture on the left from Kimball, my hometown, and you can see over time that a ponderosa pine makes a nice shade tree. There's another Kimball County plant that we talked about just briefly earlier, and that's limber pine. For those of you in southern Nebraska and western Nebraska where you're dealing with more heat and drought, give this limber pine a try. They will grow literally on a few spits of rain, hail, dust, and bird poop out there in western Nebraska. How they survive for hundreds of years like this, we don't know, but they're just saying, we're tough as nails, give us a try. Here are a few other evergreens to just whet your appetite. Bosnian pine on the left would be good for eastern Nebraska. It's a shorter variety, slower growing plant similar to Austrian pine. In the middle is Swiss stone pine, proving pretty adaptable across the state. And then on the right is southwestern white pine, probably kind of a relative of limber pine, but heat and drought tolerant and a good choice for our southern counties in Nebraska. What about spruce? I already mentioned to you problems with Colorado spruce. I would quit planting Colorado spruce in the eastern half of Nebraska, and even be careful with it in western Nebraska where it's probably overused in some of those communities. Actually, two trees that are doing better for us disease-wise are Black Hills spruce here in the middle. Similar shape and form to that Colorado spruce, but native to the Black Hills of South Dakota. And it just seems to be more disease resistant than Colorado spruce. And then on the right is Norway spruce. In the eastern half of Nebraska, this is actually the better spruce of all of them for the Lincoln, Omaha area and points southeast. There are other evergreens to think about. One of the most beautiful trees in the landscape is a concolor fir, sometimes called a white fir. This picture on the left is from the Cabbage Patch in North Omaha. That's an affiliate Arboretum site, a private property site. And they had the state champion concolor fir for a lot of years until it got struck by lightning and came apart. That's part of the story of a tall tree in Nebraska. You know, it gets its foliage up to where the sparks are flying in the atmosphere. So it's still a great tree for much of Nebraska. And then on the right, a tree we're trying to push a little harder. I took that picture just yesterday. That's a Douglas fir just to the south of East Campus here. And I have wonderful big old Douglas fir out at the school I attended in western Nebraska, and here in Lancaster County, it's proven as well. Let's say this too about Arbor Day. It's okay to have fun with trees. They don't all have to be native trees or picking some personal ecological outcome. We can have fun with some of these things too. That's some of the appeal to tree planting, right? So have fun with it. It's okay to use non-native trees that are not problematic. Here's a list of some of those things. Horse chestnut. Oh my God, do you ever see a horse chestnut in full flower with those white candelabra flowers upright at the branch tips against that dark green foliage? It's a cousin of our Ohio buckeye, but it is just absolutely stunning when it's in full flower. So there's trees like this that we can think about and put more in our landscapes. A ginkgo is fun, a Japanese zelkova, all kinds of magnolias to think about. Yes, let's have fun with trees and try some of these unusual ones. How about a Turkish filbert here on the left, a cousin of our Native American filbert, but it gets to be a big tree and kind of the spitting image of our American linden in shape, form, and color, but it's a filbert of all things. These trees in the middle, this is Chinese chestnut. It's hard to grow our American chestnut, but the Chinese chestnut grows maybe 20 to 30 feet tall. It's a tree with nuts at eye level. So you can harvest them off the tree and roast those nuts on an open fire in December and enjoy those Chinese chestnuts. And then on the right is a tree that I have in Waverly that's hard to track down. That's a 3-flower maple, an absolutely stunning Asian maple that doesn't produce viable seeds. So it's not going to be a runaway mess or an invasive plant of any kind. But look at the bark on that 3-flower maple. A tree we don't plant enough of that we have a few around that has really proven itself is the macchia, the Amur macchia. It's native to East Asia and the Amur River region of Russia and China, but it's a stunning tree, somewhat similar to our redbud in color, shape, and form, but it doesn't suffer the herbicide drift blight that our redbud does. So have fun with a macchia. And you can smell it a half a block away with its fragrant flowers. A really fun tree to have in the landscape. Believe it or not, I'd encourage you to plant a blue ash. Blue ash trees are thought to be somewhat resistant to emerald ash borer. So we can plant our native North American blue ash tree. This tree on the right is in the park in Waverly that I planted, and it's growing like a weed out there and looking really good. Some of our Midwest native hickory trees and nut trees can be a little temperamental to get started, but you would have a lot of fun with a shagbark or a shellbark hickory. Midwest native trees, the squirrels will love you for it. And we also can eat those hickory nuts. If you ever have had Bob's hickory nut pie, they're absolutely fantastic. The thing about a hickory is you don't want to try and track it down in a nursery. You want to plant the seed, the nut itself, or get a small seedling, probably from the statewide arboretum, because they have a really hard to control taproot. So you want to plant small trees and enjoy them growing from a 1 foot to 2 foot tall plant all the way up to that 50-foot tall plant in life. How about magnolias? Oh my gosh, the magnolias are starting to bloom here in eastern Nebraska on campus. Merrill magnolia, saucer magnolia, the cucumber magnolia. There's a variety called butterflies magnolia with a yellow flower. We can coax these to grow pretty well in Lincoln and Omaha and points southeast. And then, of course, the pawpaw, native to southeast Nebraska. This needs a special site consideration, typically where you're going to have part day shade and maybe consistent moisture. It's not the first tree you plant on a new acreage, but if you have kind of a woodland setting or a protected area against your house, try a pawpaw and plant 2 or 3 of them so you get cross-pollination and better fruit set. And then let's just say this. We talked about all these trees that you can plant. We have plant lists to look at. The thing to say is just don't plant these things. And then there's 300 other types you can plant. So don't plant the invaders, the invasive species that are on our watch lists, and the things that are overplanted. Like autumn blaze maple on the left is a great tree, but it's overplanted. Ornamental pear here in the middle is an invasive species, a fantastically looking ornamental tree, but we just need to quit planting it. And then for those of you in eastern Nebraska, western Nebraska, autumn olive and Russian olive, avoid those things. And let me wrap up tree selection with just this thought about hackberry and trees that are overplanted in our landscapes. Yes, a lot of our Nebraska communities, especially places like Grand Island or Gearing or my hometown of Kimball, hackberry is overrepresented in the overstory of our deciduous trees, but we have not planted young hackberries. So they are going to be aging out of our communities going forward, and we need to restart planting some of these hackberries, even though they're very common. They're a tough tree, native tree, great for wildlife. Let's take these last few minutes and say, okay, those are trees to plant. Wonderful selection of trees to think about here in eastern Nebraska, across the state, across the region. Getting the right tree in the right place is only one of the challenges. So beyond species selection, let's think about this quickly. Use good nursery stock. Plant it properly. It's not rocket science. If Justin Evertson can figure out, anybody can figure out how to plant a tree, but we still screw it up a lot. Let's talk about that. Talk about how to place the trees in the landscape. And then let's talk about reducing that conflict with turf grass and other problems we have. So first and foremost, buy from reputable nurseries who stand by their stock, and be aware that plants coming out of nurseries that are in traditional plastic containers can have bound up root systems. When you're buying a tree, the part below ground, the root system is just as important as the part above ground. So work with your nurseries to get the best quality root systems you can, so you're avoiding these pot-bound, circling, problematic roots. If you don't do that, we're seeing this happen all around us now, from trees that are 30 to 40 years old with compromised stem girdling roots. This is what you end up with down the road. We got to nail this part. Our trees will be happier and healthier and better growers if we start with good nursery stock without those circling, compacted root systems. Not all containerized trees in a plastic container are bad. The nursery industries have got this figured out. If you buy fresh product in the spring from a good nursery, it might be in a plastic container. Take it out, and those roots that I'm looking at in this picture on the right, I could easily pull those out and get them to grow laterally, and we're going to be okay. A growing trend in the nursery industry is grow bags and root production method containers that restrict that circling of roots. And they're starting to figure this out pretty well. Just be aware that it's a systems approach, and you can still get bad trees out of these systems if the nursery didn't follow it closely in its production. But these are some of the systems you have for grow bags and specialized containers, which reduce that stem girdling and root girdling in the pot. What about plant size? This is one thing I want to encourage people to think about a lot. Is it's fun to watch a tree grow. And yes, it's good to get a tree that's 10 feet tall in your landscape and you say, oh, it's doing something already. But if you can stand it, plant a small tree. The smaller the tree you plant, usually the more the root system you get to bring with it. And it's easier to get a good root system going. Look at this tree on the right by the late Jim Cluck, a nurseryman who used gravel bed. See that 3-inch caliper tree? This is the kind of root system that should come with a tree that size. And now think about the containerized tree you see in the nursery for the same size tree. There's only so much compromise we can do to still get good trees to grow. It doesn't mean you can't grow bigger trees, but enjoy planting small trees and watching them grow. Try that. It's a lot of fun. They take off and you go, oh my God, that tree's 5 feet tall, and I just planted it 2 years ago. Or how about this picture of trees I planted from acorns, bur oaks, in our school nursery out in Waverly. I did a study to compare acorn-grown trees against containerized trees. The acorn trees passed them up in 5 years, and we still have several of those in our nursery growing great guns as shade trees. And then we can't forget that proper planting is critical. I threw in the Nebraska Forest Service graphic here on the right about how to properly plant a tree. And we can look at that real quickly. And as we go along, start by planting a really good hole. Plant a $100 hole for that $100 tree. It's really going to help you out. Usually wider and more shallow. We'll talk about that. Get the tree at the right depth. You're going to water it as you put the soil back around it. You're going to mulch it when you're done. And you're not going to try to put different soil textures back in that hole. You're just going to use the same soil that came out of it, although adding organic matter to that hole, if you've had very inorganic soils or heavy clay soils, won't hurt. And that's typically what I do in Waverly. So number 1, avoid planting too deep. Those first lateral roots are just under the soil surface when we do this right. Avoid stem girdling roots and severely circling roots. Deal with them at planting time. Do not skip that part. And then timing is critical. If you can do this, plant your trees right now, this time of year, March, April into early May, and then wait until fall, which is my favorite time for deciduous trees, and then pick it up again in September, October, into December. You can plant in January if you've got a tolerable winter. The colder parts of the year are the better times of the year because the tree is less stressed out. And always add a layer of mulch around that newly planted tree. So dig a good hole, just like we talked about, wide and shallow. Obviously, you don't need to dig a 20-foot wide hole. Some of us are getting old. It helps to have augers and equipment to help us do some of this. But remember, the hole is going to be pretty shallow because when you get that tree out of the container and look at it, it's probably only 10 to 12 inches deep your hole needs to be. And then you're maybe going to be twice as wide as that container in the size of the hole you're going to dig. Does that make sense to you? I don't mind using an auger. Just be aware the bigger issue with augers is compacting the soil around the other trees you're digging in. So just be careful with that and do it in the right time of year when the soil isn't slushy or something that your container or your auger is going to dig into the ground deeply. And then deal with root issues at planting time. Do not skip this step. Warning, 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 danger. We have gotten pretty lazy about just taking trees out of a container and sticking them in the ground without knowing what the root systems are doing. There's a growing trend to try and do this if you're planting in the cool times of year, root washing those trees so you can see exactly what the roots are doing. If you can get all that porous growing medium off, then you can cut and pull out the roots to get them laterally spreading. Look at this guy on the right, the tree he planted just perfectly. He's got the roots exposed. It's a cool time of the year. He knows exactly how deep it needs to be, and he dug that hole a little wider to accommodate those expanded roots. And then we talked about timing is critical, cool part of the year. If you've got a container tree with all these matted up roots at the side of it that are hard to pull apart, you can shave them, literally shave them or square that root mass with a saw or a very sharp spade. If you don't do that, you're going to be in trouble. So take the time to do that if you want to try and save that tree. And then planting depth, not too deep. And this is another reason why you want to do some root washing or expose those roots so you know exactly how deep that tree needs to be in the hole. Those first lateral roots are just under the soil surface. In fact, poking up above the ground a little might be even better once you add mulch on top of them. So get that depth just right. Those first lateral roots, and a trunk flare is visible at the ground level, especially with deciduous trees. I hope you can see my cursor on a tree that has nice trunk flare, but they had buried it too deeply and they didn't realize they had these hooking stem girdling roots coming over the root system. Now they can save that tree by cutting those roots, but it would have been better to get it right, like this mature oak tree on the upper right from the planting day. Look at what they're doing here on the far right. This is a picture from Better Homes and Garden telling us how to plant tree. Don't do this. Don't just pull it right out of the container and stick it into the hole. You have to be doing something to figure out what those roots are doing. I can't emphasize that enough. Some trees come bald and burlap, big, heavy trees that we need to think about, and people get confused. What do I do with the burlap and the wire basket? Again, the most important thing is to get this tree at the right depth. You can take that ball apart on the side of the hole and then see what the root system is like and then get it in the hole. That's a pretty good approach. Or you can put the whole thing in the hole, get it at the right depth, and then peel back the burlap and the wire basket, get it out of the way as deep into that hole as you can. Just pay attention. This picture on the lower left, where the burlap, the twine, and everything is left back on, is telling you they didn't do it right. All of that stuff should have been peeled back or cut back deep into the hole. Here on the far right is how a properly planted balled and burlap tree should look at the end of the process. And then finishing up, use the whole soil for your backfill soil. Don't add a different soil gradient to that. Don't change from a clay soil to a porous soil or sand, or don't add gravel or anything like that. Use the whole soil for backfill. But you can add compost and organic matter, maybe composting mulch or leaf mold or something like that. Don't tamp the soil to firmness around the tree. It's okay to add organic matter if needed. Don't haul soil away. Water as you go. Form a moat for water and to hold the mulch. Do you see this tree on the far right? They've done a really pretty good job of planting that tree. One thing I see in the background that causes me a little concern is you should not be hauling any soil away from a properly planted tree. Otherwise, you might have pushed that tree too deep in the landscape. Everything's going to settle a little bit. So plant it a little high. And if anything, use this soil to create a little moat to capture your water and your mulch when you're done planting. Stake and mulch properly. Mulch would be about 3 to 4 inches deep and in a wide, at least out to the drip line of a tree if you can do it. And then when we're staking, use broad strapping to tie to the tree. Don't use wire and hose or twine or anything like that that will cause a rubbing or pinch injury to that trunk if you can avoid it. Should you stake trees? Yes. In eastern Nebraska, you may not need to keep the wind from blowing them over, but here's why I would do that. It gives you some sustenance in the landscape for the first few years when the mowers and the string trimmers are going to come around and do the hardest damage to these young trees. I almost always put a stake on my trees to give them some prominence in the landscape. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but learn from Mother Nature. She plants trees tightly in the landscape. Wherever you can, plant trees in groups and plant trees with other things, shrubs and ground covers and shade-tolerant plants. And you'll be able to create these islands that are really conducive to good root health for trees and woody plants. Plants in mass help each other grow, and they are much safer from all the damage we inflict from lawn care. Here's how Mother Nature does it. She doesn't give a crap, does she? She puts your shade trees 10 feet apart and laughs at you and says, yep, these trees are going to be tall and they're going to help each other grow. And then the importance of mulch and organic matter. Try to remember that a tree grows in the woods with all this decaying organic matter coming back to the soil all the time. That's where these trees originate from. Let's mimic that in our home landscapes where we can, either by planting in mass as a mini forest or putting mulch around our trees. And then we're getting this soil fungal collaborative effort going on that is really incredible to tree health. Part of this system we know is the wood wide web, the mycorrhiza, which are symbiotic soil fungi with trees, really love it in an organic soil where things are decaying. Here's how we often do it. I don't mean to make fun of anybody particularly here. If this is your tree or you, I apologize, but this is not how we get better trees. We don't put them in concrete block prisons or anything like that and then compete with this really hard effort at lawn care. We're shortchanging the health of those trees. So in summary, for better trees and landscapes, plant more trees. We got to get jiggy with it, people. We did a better job of this 50 or 60 years ago, and we're losing the momentum. Help care for trees, emphasize native species, exclude invasives, less scattering of trees and more communal groupings, be smart with that lawn care, and then improve and sustain soil health. So tree planting most definitely is one of the best things we can do for ourselves, for the environment, for our communities, for our neighborhoods. So yeah, let's do it. Let's get after it and have fun with tree planting this spring. I'm going to stop the share there. Thank you very much. I meant to leave more time here to have a conversation with some of you about the trees you like. So if you're willing to chime in, does anybody want to turn on their microphone and tell me what are some of the better trees that they're seeing or have fun with out where you're at? Who are you and where are you? If you don't chime in, Anybody? Do you have your microphone on, Marilyn?
You know, Justin, I know Bob doesn't carry it real frequently, but I've really enjoyed my Chinese wingnut.
Yeah.
It grows really well. There's one on University of Nebraska Kearney campus. I'm sure that some of the Mike and Kendra are familiar with that tree. And I just think it's a fantastic one.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out, Graham. I've got a couple in the Waverly Arboretum. They're a relative of our walnut, believe it or not.
Mm-hmm.
Bob Fuhrer, did I see you maybe get ready to chime in? Bob Fuhrer planted an arboretum, the Franklin Cotterell Greens at the North Bend School up in North Bend. And you've had a lot of fun with trees over the years. What do you like, Bob? I'm not hearing from you. I see you turned your microphone off. What about anybody out in Kearney? Kearney's a fun place to go explore trees. Mike, what are you getting to grow out in the parks in Kearney?
We've been planting a lot of lindens, a lot of oaks, of course. We even settle for some locusts on occasion as well.
Yeah, right. You've got a challenge out there to keep things alive for sure. I love that neighborhood south of the UNK campus with all the neat diversity of trees in there. There's probably the tallest smoke tree I've ever seen in Nebraska. And then those wonderful pecans and big old bur oaks and red oaks out there in the middle of Nebraska. It's fantastic.
So Justin, Kathy had a question. Graham addressed it a little bit, but you might have something else to add. She was asking how to determine the genetic provenance of a tree.
Really good question. It's going to be hard even for a good nursery to say exactly where they originated from. But if you ask that question to the nursery, they're at least paying attention to your needs, and they'll probably give you the information they have out of it. So, but one good thing about the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum, you're going to know the provenance of those trees because Bob will order from growers that are dealing with Midwest natives, or he collected most of the seeds himself. And then I don't want to put in a specific plug to any one nursery, but Great Plains Nursery up here north of Lincoln is one of our few Nebraska nurseries that are growing seeds from locally collected efforts. And they really do pay close attention to the provenance, the origination of those seeds. So it is a tough nut to crack, pardon the pun, in some of our efforts.
There's one other question from Jane, who says they have a blue spruce that's really close to their house and they've been considering removing it because they have concerns about fire. So should they be worried? It's mature and not showing any signs of disease.
Where did they say they were at, Michelle?
She didn't say, Jane, if you want to add that. She doesn't say what part of the state she's in.
Okay, blue spruce next to a house.
Yeah.
I wouldn't worry about the fire part of it, but here's another issue with blue spruce. If they're big and old, this last week we had a horrible windstorm, and out in western Nebraska, Cheyenne,
she's in Lincoln.
Scotts Bluff, a lot of spruce blew over. They get to be 80 years old and maybe 80 to 90 feet tall, and there is that potential when they're right near a house. That would be my bigger concern. Not so much about fire, though, for Nebraska.
Yeah, she said she's in Lincoln, but I mean, it was even windy here.
Yeah. You guys
Last
wouldn't believe some of the damage that happened out west with trees blowing over last week. 70-mile-per-hour winds out in Cheyenne, Kimball County, Scotts Bluff.
That's crazy.
And spruce are an important tree out there.
Bob said his mic wasn't working, but his favorites, ginkgo, limber pine, oaks, English oak, buckeye, staghorn sumac. For the visuals, tulip trees, for good leaf shape. So there's some. suggestions there. And then Lisa has a question about red bud. Do you discourage using red bud because it's susceptible to drift? Would
Yeah.
you recommend
Oh.
that? What was that other one?
Great.
Machia?
Yeah, Ammermachia. Great question, Lisa. I love redbud. Wow, that's one of my early favorite trees. And unfortunately, in Waverly, where I'm at, the drift from farm herbicide practices is making it hard to keep redbuds alive. But if you're in the heart of Lincoln and Omaha, I wouldn't worry too much about that. You'll see some drift damage. They are the canary in the coal mine for herbicide damage on trees. So it's hard to see a really great redbud anymore, even in our cities. But in Lincoln and Omaha, definitely give them a go. And I think you'll have good luck with a redbud. They're fantastic trees. Yeah, Bob said we nicknamed them Deadbud. Yes, the one that you identify in your planting will die. I hear you, Bob. Yep.
That's so sad.
Redbuds are just starting to bloom. Their red buds are going to open up with that pink color here shortly, and they're fantastic trees. So, hey, everybody who's a certified arborist, I didn't get the forms properly filled out to do this thing online that Graham is so good at, but Marilyn and others, if you want to enter in your certification number in the text now, I will add that to our list and get it to the right place. Either that's ISA or NAA arborist certification. So please type it into the text. Or yeah, there you go, Mike. Thank you. That helps. That's perfect. Any other quick comments, concerns, or admonitions? Speak now or forever hold your peace, but please go out and plant a tree this Arbor Day. It really is one of the best things we can do for ourselves and our communities. Thanks, Nicole, Kendra. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in.
Yeah. All right, we will just leave that
Stay
up
on
for.
the line just a couple more. I'll stay on the line for a while, Michelle, and make sure I get all the.
Okay, I'm gonna
See
stop
you.
the recording.
Yeah, you can stop the recording.